Greetings, my name is Kerry and welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you my March wrap up. So I'm filming this on the 31st of March because it's the only chance I've really got, but having finished 3 books this weekend, I'm fairly confident that I won't finish any more in March, so slightly preemptive, but we're going with it anyway. In March I read a total of 10 books, which is as many as I read in January and February combined, and I also read the longest book I've read so far this year in the month. So I don't know what happened the first 2 months of the year. They were just particularly slow months apparently, or this was a particularly good month. We'll see as the year goes on. Anyway, so of the books I read, 3 were ones I'd borrowed, 2 were new ones that I bought this year, and 5 were from my owned TBR, so that was a good little dent in that. However, I did add a lot of books to my TBR this month, as you'll have seen from my haul. Yeah, so that was alright. It's fairly good in terms of balance. I'm trying to read all the books I buy this year, so I got 2 books that I bought in February I read in March, which is pretty good. The majority were novels, were fiction, but there were 3 non-fiction books that I read, and I did fairly well for some of my challenges as well. So 1 book I read was from my book Death Row, 3 books counted towards the indie challenge, and I also managed to complete 1 series. And then for ratings, I gave 2 books 3 stars, 7 books 4 stars, and 1 book 5 stars. So without further ado, let's get on to the books. So if you're familiar with my wrap-ups, I tend to go through the books from least favourite through to favourite, or at least in terms of rating from lowest rated to highest rated. So starting with my 3-star reads, the first book that I gave 3 stars to this month was actually the first book I finished in March. I nearly finished it in February. I had about, I don't know, maybe 30 pages to go when I fell asleep on the 28th. I fell asleep reading it on the 28th, which I was very annoyed about. So I woke up and finished it on the 1st of March because I was on leave. And that was The Moving Finger by Agatha Christie. This is the 4th Miss Marple book, I believe. I didn't enjoy this as much as the other ones. It's just the way gender was portrayed in it. Like, there are a lot of angry spinsters, or it felt like that, and like this sort of insinuation that, so the basic premise of this is that anonymous letters have been sent to everyone in this village saying some quite nasty things about them, but they're all way off the mark, and then someone apparently commits suicide as a result of receiving one of these letters, only some people don't believe it's suicide. And I mean, it's fairly good in terms of a detective novel. I liked the narrator and his sister. They were quite fun characters, but there was this whole thing the whole time about, oh, this anonymous letter writing is such a female crime, and I don't know, it felt quite narrow-minded in that sense in some ways, but some of the characters are really good. My other criticism of it is that Miss Marple's barely in it. She sort of turns up at the end and figures everything out. Yeah, so I didn't enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed the other Marple books so far, so yeah, so that's why it got 3 stars. There were parts of the story that I liked, but overall I didn't enjoy it as much as the others, so it didn't get as highly rated as the others, which I think so far I've given them all 4 stars. So that was that one. The second book I gave 3 stars to this month I got from the library. This was Always and Forever Lara Jean by Jenny Han. This is the final book in the To All the Boys I Loved Before trilogy. I actually enjoyed this one the most out of the whole trilogy. It would have been maybe 3.5, 4 stars, but I just have sort of given the whole series 3 stars, so it was on a par but slightly more enjoyable. I think the reasons why I enjoyed this one more than the previous 2 were there was less of the girl hate trope in it, which featured quite heavily in the first 2, and I don't like that as a trope. And I also liked the way Lara Jean's character developed. She had a bit more self-confidence, a bit more self-determination in this one. She was more ready to make her own choices and not be so heavily influenced by everyone else, which I found a bit refreshing because she was a bit of a damp squib in the first couple of books. So yeah, so I did quite enjoy that one. They're nice, easy reads. I think I read that book in a day. Yeah, so it's an enjoyable series. It's not one that I'd think I'll reread. I was quite happy to get them out from the library. I probably won't buy my own copies of them. Yeah, so that was my 3-star books for the month. Now on to the 4-star books, and actually this was a really good reading month for me. To have all bar 2 of the books be 4 or 5 stars, I'm really happy with that. So the first book I gave 4 stars to was one that I actually started in January, and I've sort of been picking up and putting it down, but I finally finished it at the beginning of March, and this is The Outrun by Amy Liptrot. I got this in a Ninja book box actually, and I really love it. I love the cover as well, it's so beautiful. This is Amy Liptrot's memoir of her recovery from alcoholism. She grew up on the Orkney Islands and then moved to London as a student and developed a dependence on alcohol. And she gets to a point where she realises that this is ruining her life. She goes to rehab, and as she's sort of finishing her time in rehab, she's trying to figure out what she's going to do to try and stay off the alcohol, and decides to go back up to Orkney. And it's just sort of really from that point as a love letter to the Orkney Islands, and the descriptions of the wildlife and the scenery are just so beautiful, make me really want to visit Orkney. So that's going on my travel bucket list of places I really want to go and visit. And yeah, it was just really beautifully written. She has a really lyrical writing style and really conveys the scenery very well, so I really highly recommend this, particularly if you like memoirs. This is a really nice one. This ticked off a few challenges for the Indie Challenge as well, so I'm doing pretty well on the Indie Challenge now actually. I've ticked off quite a lot of squares, some of them more than once, so I use this for recommended by a friend because it's one that Bex from Ninja Book Box has talked about a few times and highly recommended. It's Amy Liptrot's debut. It is biography or memoir. It is a book from my TBR. It's from a press over 20 years old. The publisher is Canongate. They've been around since the 70s. It is an award winner. So the book itself is winner of the Wainwright Prize, and Canongate have won Publisher of the Year a couple of times. And it is non-fiction. So that ticked off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 categories on the Indie Challenge for me. So that was really good going. The next book I gave 4 stars to was one of my most anticipated releases of the year. It was my first pre-order of the year. It is On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. This is her follow-up to The Hate U Give. It's set in the same neighbourhood as The Hate U Give, but about a year later. It follows a different character called Brianna, who wants to become a rap star. Her father was fairly well-known rap artist in their local area, was just sort of beginning to get quite famous when he was killed in a gang incident. Since then, her family's been really struggling to make ends meet. Brianna's still in high school and she wants to contribute, but her mother won't let her and wants her to focus on her education. So Brianna's big idea is that she's going to make it big as a rap artist and then be able to support her family that way. So it's all about her sort of trying to make waves in the rap community, but alongside that it sort of covers her struggles at school. She goes to an arts school where there's a minority of Black and Hispanic students, and they often feel like they are targeted particularly by the security guards, also by the teachers at the school. And so it's sort of her trying to deal with that as well, and her friends wanting her to become a bit of a figurehead for a movement, but she doesn't really want that. And so there's quite a lot of friend politics, which I really enjoyed as well, because there's not enough YA novels that focus on friendships rather than relationships, and there is like a hint of romance in there, but it didn't dominate the story, which I quite liked. It sort of it was a side plot and it didn't feel like too much of a big deal, which was quite refreshing because a lot of YA just really focuses on romance. So yeah, so I really enjoyed this. I actually think I probably enjoyed it a bit more than The Hate U Give. Don't know if that's quite a controversial thing to say, because it was more day to day. I think it didn't have quite the drama and the impact of The Hate U Give, and so they're very different books in that sense. And for me, this was more of an insight into daily life for the people living in these communities. In that sense, I found it more impactful and more educational, I guess, for me as a white British person. So I really highly recommend this. If you liked The Hate U Give, you'll probably enjoy this one. If you haven't read either of them, you really need to get on that, because they are really powerful novels describing stuff that is going on in communities, and I'm sure not just in America, I'm sure there are similar situations in Britain as well. This also I used for the Indie Challenge for several categories. So this covered author from another country, kids or YA, marginalised people, a press over 20-year-old, published by Walker Books in the UK, which is an independent publisher focusing on children and young adult literature, and a book by a favourite author because I do like Angie Thomas. So there we go, that was On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. The next book I gave 4 stars to was The Wrong Messiah by Nick Page. This was one I've been borrowing from my dad. I actually have been borrowing it for a very long time and sort of had read half of it a few years ago and then thought I really need to get on and read the rest of it. So I picked it up in January, started rereading it. It is non-fiction. It is sort of attempting to be, say biographical is not necessarily the right word, but it's trying to piece together the history of the Gospels in the Bible and the story of Jesus's life in chronological order in context. So he's really researched the culture of the time, the history, the politics, the association with Rome, all that sort of stuff, and really done a lot of work into putting all that together and then trying to reconstruct a timeline of the events in the Gospels and how they fit together, because those 4 books in the Bible are covering the same story but from different angles and place emphasis on different events, and some events are mentioned in all 4 of them and some are only mentioned in one, so he's trying to work out what the timeline is of that. Really good, really enjoyed it, really detailed information, and can tell it's really been well researched. So regardless of what you think of whether you think Jesus was a Messiah or not, if you want an insight into the culture of the time and why people think he is, then this is a really good one to look at. Dad's now lent me the follow-up. Can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it's about the formation of the early church, so I'll be picking up that soon, and I will actually be returning this one to him soon, and he'll be very pleased, I'm sure. The next book that I gave 4 stars to was When God Was a Rabbit by Sarah Winman. This was from my book Death Row. I picked up a few Death Row books and read the first chapter of them in this month, and a few of them I've decided to get rid of, but this one I thought actually I quite enjoyed the first chapter, so I decided to read the whole thing, and I actually really enjoyed it. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. It is sort of a family story set across 2 periods, so it starts with Ellie, the main character. It starts with when she's born in the late 60s and sort of covers her childhood up to her early teens, and then it jumps forward about 20 years to her being in her late 20s, early 30s, and covers the events when she and her brother are grown up. It really focuses on their family, so mainly her relationship with her brother, but also with her parents and her aunt and her best friend, who has one of my favourite names from a novel ever, Jenny Penny. It's really just a lovely, quite nostalgic book, and for me particularly the second half was more nostalgic because the events you were talking about from Ellie's adulthood were events that were happening when I was a child that I remember, so things like Princess Diana's death in the late 90s and the turn of the millennium and that sort of thing. So I really enjoyed it in that sense. It was a really lovely picture of family life, quite a quirky little family, which I quite liked. Some of the events from the childhood were quite fun as well. There is some quite heavy content in here as well though, so trigger warning for sexual abuse. Both Ellie and one of her friends experience sexual abuse as children. It's not overtly in the text, it's just sort of suggested in the text, but it's referred to throughout the rest of the novel at places. And so if you're sensitive to that, you might find it quite difficult to read those portions of the text. So if that's something that you're sensitive to, maybe don't read this one. But I thought it was handled really well, really sensitively, and it felt very, very apt in sort of the current Me Too culture, where a lot more allegations have been coming out about sexual abuse, that it felt very apt, particularly Ellie's reaction when she's older, when she reflects back on it, and how her parents find out about it when she's an adult, and sort of how she deals with that is very sensitively done, I felt, as someone who has no experience of any of that kind of thing. But overall I really enjoyed this book, and I gave it 4 stars, which was a surprise because I almost didn't read it. So I'm glad that I did, and it's actually one I'm probably going to keep and maybe read in the future. So that was that one. Next we have another Agatha Christie, so this is the 5th Marple book. I've actually got a little bit behind on Mission Marple, so I just finished this one this weekend. So this is A Murder is Announced. This one, Miss Marple was in it a lot more, so I did enjoy it more, gave it 4 stars. It was more on a par with the early ones in the series that I quite enjoyed. This was set just after the Second World War, so it's quite an insight into rationing and sort of black market trading a little bit, and some of that stuff going on. It's quite convoluted plot in this one. I was quite pleased with myself that I worked out some of the ins and outs of who people were and how their stories fitted together. I didn't quite get the whole of the reveal, but I got some of it, so I always feel quite clever when that happens, because to me a really good detective novel isn't necessarily, it doesn't mean that you don't work it out, if that makes sense. So there should be evidence in a good detective novel that you can figure out, if not the whole of the reveal, then at least some of it, because that means the author's done their job well. If the reveal is completely out of nowhere, and like I've read detective novels in the past where the character who turns out to be the murderer does not even enter the story until the reveal, and then you're like, well, where did that come from? So I much prefer books where there are hints and clues and you can kind of figure it out, but there are also some red herrings. So I really enjoyed the setup of this. I liked a lot of the characters and was, yeah, as I say, quite pleased with myself that I figured out at least part of the reveal, if not the whole lot. So I really highly recommend it. Next, I finally finished Revelations of Divine Love by Julian of Norwich. I started reading this last autumn. It's quite heavy going, but really, it's really deep. I really loved it. It's based on, so Julian of Norwich was an anchoress. Can never quite remember if that's the right term or not. Anyway, so she was a bit like a nun, but rather than living in a community, she lived in isolation. She had a little cell on the side of a church, and she had a maid who came in and like gave her meals and stuff, but other than that she lived on her own and just spent her time praying and reflecting. And she did have visitors who she would share her wisdom with, but when she was quite young, before she was an anchoress, she had a vision, and then she wrote down and reflected on her vision when she was older, and so the book is sort of her reflections on her vision of God that she had when she was younger. So it's quite deep. There's some really great insights into God as a loving father, which I found really apt and really helpful to me. So I'm really glad to have finally read this, and I will definitely reread it in the future. And then the final book that I gave 4 stars to was also the last book that I finished in March, and this is The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicole Yoon. This I got from the library again. So I'd intended to read this in February for Blackathon, and I didn't quite get around to it. And this was another one where I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. I actually picked it up because I'd seen the trailer, because I think there's a movie coming out soon, I'm not sure how soon. So I was really intrigued by the trailer, so I thought I'd pick up the book, and I did really enjoy it. It has one of my least favourite tropes in it, which is insta-love, although it tries to make you think it's not insta-love, but it kind of is. But actually I didn't mind it too much because of the whole way the book is set up, with the 2 main characters take turns in telling the story, but then there were also other little inserts about science and history and different characters that appear briefly. So I thought it was really well constructed. It's YA again, quite a light read, and although again deals with some quite difficult topics. Natasha, one of the main characters, her family are undocumented immigrants in the States and are about to be deported, and Daniel, the other main character, is from a family of Korean immigrants, and his parents have really high expectations of him and his brother, and he wants to follow his own path in life and not follow the path that they are setting out for him. So some quite difficult topics covered in there, but generally quite a light read, quite enjoyable. So I gave this one 4 stars, and I will probably check out everything at some point. Again, I saw trailers for that film when that was being released and was pretty sure I figured out the whole of the plot from the trailer, so I've been in 2 minds, but there was a short excerpt at the end of this book, so I might give it a try at some point. I haven't definitely decided yet, but this one I really did enjoy. The final book that I have to talk about that I read in March was my 5-star read of the month, which if you've been following me on Twitter you probably know what it's going to be, but it is heavy. It is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. I'm still in love with this dust jacket. It's so beautiful, this cover. So this is an epic fantasy. It is so beautifully written. I really loved the characters. You could sort of tell the inspirations of some of the different kingdoms in this novel, and I loved the sort of interaction and the politics of it. I really liked most of the characters. There was one character who was not very likeable, but I don't think you were meant to like him, so I didn't. But the other characters I really liked. I really liked the different kinds of dragons. There weren't just fire-breathing dragons, there were water dragons in this as well, and I really liked the sort of epic battle of good versus evil. There were romances, there was action and adventure and quests and knights and quite a lot of things that I really liked about it. So I really liked the sort of the religious themes of like the different kingdoms have different religions and how do they interact with each other. So this one kingdom has sort of isolated itself from anyone that doesn't agree with its religion, and then there are other countries that have isolated themselves to prevent the spread of plague and that sort of thing, so it's sort of how do they work together. And I think my favourite thing about this book was the ending, because I really like it when you kind of feel like the story is still continuing without you when you finish reading a book. I liked the sort of sense that actually these lives are ongoing, and it leaves the door open for there to be more books set in this world. I don't think there are intended to be sequels, but I would love to know more about some of the different kingdoms and their histories, and I think it's a really ripe world for Samantha Shannon to write more books set in the different countries. So I really hope that she writes more in this world, and I'm definitely going to be checking out her series, which off the top of my head I can't think what it's called, but I know my library has them, so I'm going to try and get them out at some point and read them too. But I nearly didn't pre-order this, and I'm so glad I did, and I cannot praise it highly enough. So if you like fantasy, then I think you'll definitely enjoy this. If you're unsure about fantasy and intimidated by the size, I would say give it a try anyway. It didn't feel as heavy as a lot of fantasies do to me, but then I do read fantasy, so I'm probably a bit biased. But it wasn't a difficult read, even though it was quite big and heavy. It was beautifully written. The Priory of the Orange Tree also counted for my indie challenge, so I used this for 3 categories. So this is genre fiction because it's a fantasy novel. It's from a press over 20 years old because it's published by Bloomsbury in the UK, and it features LGBTQIA characters, several of them actually, and so that was really refreshing as well, so that was really good. So that's all the books I read in March. I haven't really decided too much what I'm going to read in April yet. I have just started today The Chosen Ones by Scarlet Thomas, so this is the second book in the Worldquake sequence. The third one, Gala Glass, comes out in April, so I wanted to at least be reading the second one before the third one came out. Yeah, I've read a couple of chapters and I'm enjoying it so far. I can only vaguely remember what happened in the first one, Dragon's Green, so I'm sure it will come back to me as I carry on reading though. The series follows Effie Truelove and her friends in a world. So there's been this event called the Worldquake, and sort of society has slightly fallen apart afterwards, and then there are other worlds. There's another world called the Other World, and there's one called the Underworld, which are sort of magical realms. And Effie and her friends realise that they've had an epiphany, which means they have awoken magical powers in themselves, and they're now starting to learn how to use them. There's also this theme of if you're the last person to read a book, then it bestows power upon you. So that is how Effie initially got her power. She was the last person to read a book called Dragon's Green in the first book. And so there's sort of this theme of this evil character in the book, or evil society in the book, who are trying to destroy books so that they can be the last readers of the books, so that they get the power from the books. I'm not sure that I've explained that very well, but anyway, so I've just started this one. This is a middle grade series, so it's sort of aimed at teenagers, I guess, sort of early teens. I really highly recommend this series, so I'm looking forward to getting properly stuck into this and to the third one coming out soon. Other than that, I haven't really decided what else I'm going to try and read. I haven't read anything for my Read Around the World challenge for a couple of months, so I'll probably try and get to a few of them and tick off some things for some of my other challenges. I'm also meant to be getting a proof from a publisher for a book that's coming out fairly soon, so hopefully that'll arrive in time for me to actually review it before it comes out, so keep your eye out for that. I would tell you what it's called, but I can't remember off the top of my head. And then basically anything else that I'm going to read are things that I said I'd read last month that I haven't read yet. Just follow me on Twitter or Goodreads, those links will be in the description, and then you can find out what I'm reading as I'm reading it. So that is the solution to that. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books, or if you're planning to read any of them, what you think of them. Please like this video if you liked it. Please subscribe if you haven't. And you can follow me on social media, as I mentioned, that will be down in the description. And yeah, that's all for today. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye!